I'm Abby Hornacek.
I'm Ben Domenech.
I'm Dana Perino, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Friday, March 24th, 2023, I'm Mike Emanuel. This week, lawmakers took TikTok to task on Capitol Hill as Xi Jinping concluded his summit with Russia's Vladimir Putin. The House Foreign Affairs Committee chairman says Washington must wake up to our greatest foreign threat.
This is the biggest threat I see is really long-term is the Chinese Communist Party.
I'm Chris Foster. TikTok CEO says the video sharing platform is safe and not a Chinese government tool.
Lawmakers across the board appear unconvinced, saying, listen, ultimately this company is under the control of the CCP in one way or the other, and it doesn't have America's best interests at heart.
We're speaking with Fox News Sunday host Shannon Bream.
And I'm Jason Chaffetz. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
Republicans and Democrats in Washington don't agree on much of anything, and yet both sides seem awfully concerned about the social media platform TikTok. House Energy and Commerce Chair Republican Kathy McMorris Rodgers set a serious tone with TikTok CEO testifying before her committee.
TikTok has repeatedly chosen the path for more control, more surveillance, and more manipulation.
Then it was California Democrat Congressman Tony Cardenas going after TikTok CEO Shu Chu.
Is there a corporation that has any authority above TikTok?
TikTok is a subsidiary of ByteDance, which is founded by a Chinese founder.
Is it a Chinese company?
I frequently have these discussions with others on what is a company that is now global.
That's okay. I prefer you answer the question and stop dancing verbally on it.
Also in the hot seat Thursday, Secretary of State Tony Blinken before the House Foreign Affairs Committee. The focus there, the Biden administration's awkward withdrawal from Afghanistan.
There are several Americans who are being detained by the Taliban. We are working to secure their freedom.
Former Green Beret and Florida Republican Congressman Michael Waltz says the Biden administration turned its back on America's trusted friends.
They left over 80,000 of our allies who stood and fought with us, and the Taliban right now using data that we left behind, biometrics, fingerprints, registries, are hunting them down and killing them as we speak.
Another hot story this week, the growing unholy alliance between China and Russia after China's leader Xi Jinping paid a visit to Moscow earlier this week. House China Committee Chairman Republican Mike Gallagher took note of it on Fox's America's Newsroom.
We face a very determined competitor in the form of the Chinese Communist Party that wants to undermine our sovereignty, wants to undermine our alliances, and is committing genocide, something we thought was unthinkable in the modern era.
Top lawmakers are watching to see if talks between Xi Jinping of China and Vladimir Putin of Russia produce any meaningful results.
I think it's a major concern. This goes back to the Beijing Olympics when Mr. Putin and Chairman Xi met.
Texas Congressman Michael McCall, a Republican, is chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
To discuss their unlimited partnership, they called it, this unholy alliance, talked about invading Ukraine. And we're seeing, Mike, we're seeing more and more evidence of at least support from China. They buy all Russian energy to finance and support the war effort. But now we're starting to see, components going in, software for surveillance, drones. And I'm afraid after this meeting, what you're going to see, I believe Mr. Putin was begging him to give him lethal weapons because he's running out of his stock supply. And he's already begged Iran and North Korea, and they're delivering. And I think the next step is going to be, you're going to see China putting lethal weapons into the conflict. So I think it's a great concern. Talk to the Secretary of State about this, at the hearing, but also privately, and how we need to call him out on this. We need to think about sanctions, and I would recommend that we declassify, the documents pertaining to this so the American people have a better understanding about this alliance.
In terms of the alliance, what's the impact? You mentioned Ukraine, but also Taiwan.
Well, I think what happens in Ukraine has a direct impact on Taiwan. It directly impacts Chairman Xi's calculations on whether to, as he calls it, reunify Taiwan with China by an invasion. This is the biggest threat I see is really long term is the Chinese Communist Party. I do think Chairman Xi is going to try to influence the election that will come up, the presidential election next January, so he could take it over without a shot fired. If he's not successful, then I think he'll go to this military blockade scenario with a full-fledged military invasion.
There was some talk that President Xi, who was claiming his goal is to be a neutral mediator in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, would call President Volodymyr Zelensky while he was visiting Moscow. Do you think there's anything to that, or do you think he's just merely bluffing on the international stage?
I think it's deception. I don't see how China can be an objective arbiter and a peacemaker in a war that they're directly involved in as an ally of Moscow and Putin. So, and it's all four of them involved in this. I mean, Iran's, putting their Iranian drones in Crimea that are causing damage. North Korea sending artillery shells. And so, I mean, to me, it's kind of laughable that they could be the objective arbiter, again, in a conflict that they're directly on the side of Russia on.
What are your concerns about these outside weapons coming in terms of the impact on the war in Ukraine? Does it just drag it out longer and longer?
Yeah, that is my concern. I've been very critical of this administration for, slow walking the pace of the weapons. We should have been putting these weapons in before the invasion for deterrence. And they've just been incredibly slow. Had we given them everything we have to date a year ago, we'd probably be in a very different situation. But if you're just going to trickle the weapons in just enough to get them by, then my concern is it drags out. And that's precisely what Putin wants. And he knows that will also impact probably the will of the American people, but also the will of our European partners.
The TikTok CEO was on Capitol Hill testifying to lawmakers that the app is safe and secure and should not be banned. He promised more transparency and said they're working to protect U.S. user data from unauthorized foreign data. What should we make of this? Do you buy it?
Yeah, I don't. TikTok's on a charm offensive, and they have these influencers in Washington right now that make all this money off TikTok, which I find interesting. But the bottom line is, Congress banned the app for ourselves, but we're allowing it to be used by our children primarily. And it is a backdoor into your iPhone. It can access your data. It can access your keystrokes, your passwords. It can influence you with the algorithms. Until ByteDance is willing to completely move out of Beijing, I will not be satisfied. I think one of the issues here is that they still want the algorithms operated out of Beijing. And to me, that's, it's not just me, it's every national security advisor in this administration has talked about what a threat it is, from the CIA director, to the FBI director. And I agree with them. I marked up and passed out of my committee a bill that would give the constitutional framework to move forward to authorize the president to ban TikTok in the United States. I think ideally what you want to see is an American-owned and operated company that can do the social media.
So Republicans and Democrats in Washington don't agree on much these days, but do you think this idea of banning TikTok could be something where both sides come together and say, you know what, we got to protect our kids, we got to protect our country?
I do. I really think China is one of those areas where we have really a great opportunity to be bipartisan. I chaired the China Task Force. We had a lot of bipartisan recommendations. We passed a lot of bills. But to your point, I really do think there is an opportunity to do what's best for America rather than putting our partisan stripes ahead of that.
A big focus of Thursday's hearing was accountability for foreign policy mistakes, and it led to an intense exchange with Secretary of State Blinken when you asked for the State Department to hand over an Afghanistan dissent cable, a document that warned about the likelihood of a Taliban takeover if the U.S. executed a withdrawal. Tell us why you think this dissent cable is so important.
Well, it's important to the veterans and the Gold Star mothers. It's important to get answers as to what happened. This is a very rare thing that's done within the State Department where you have a dissent cable that can go to the Secretary of State directly out of the embassy, in this case, Kabul. 23 embassy employees dissented to the policy of this administration. We want to see that cable, and we think the American people are entitled to see that cable. I'm giving the Secretary a deadline of Monday, close of business, before I serve a subpoena, because I want to know what the embassy, what their objections were to the policies being implemented at that time, many of which resulted in the deaths of 13 servicemen and women, 140 Afghans, and 50 wounded by the suicide bomber. Which, by the way, Mike, we have this compelling, powerful testimony from the Marine Sergeant Vargas Andrews about how he had the suicide bomber in his sights and met with his team, and they ran it up the chain of command and were not given authority to engage or permission to engage the suicide bomber. Think about the difference that would have made had they been able to take out the threat before that bomb went off. And I think very dramatically today, we had the mother, of the Marine Sergeant female officer who was actually killed and died that day. And it was very emotional.
What do you think that document would tell us about the mistakes of the Afghan withdrawal? How damning would it be, do you think?
Well, I think when you have your diplomats on the ground in Kabul, 23 of them with the dissent cable, I think it's going to be a very eye-opening document. I think it'll be a very damaging reflection on the administration and the poor policy decisions that were made, which is precisely, Mike, why they don't want to turn it over. We've tried to do this in a cooperative way, but I think the fact that they're so nervous about turning it over probably speaks volumes. And I think that's why, if they refuse to do it, I will move forward with a subpoena, because it's too important. We need to know what our diplomats on the ground, what were their objections to this administration's policies.
You made reference to a former ambassador who is calling BS on the Biden administration's cover-up of this dissent cable. Tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting. So they cite as a precedent to not produce the dissent cable, a 1979 dissent cable under Henry Kissinger. Kissinger didn't want it, produced to Congress because it was embarrassing, probably like this one. So we called the former ambassador who wrote that dissent cable back in 1979, and in his words, not mine, Mike, he said that's bull. So I repeated the ambassador's words to the Secretary of State that he thought it was bull, that the American people and Congress have every right to see a dissenting cable, particularly in something of this magnitude, where you had 13 servicemen and women killed. I think those families and the families of the others who died and were wounded have the right to know what the objections were to the policies that led to such a catastrophic event at the Abbey Gate.
House Foreign Affairs Chairman Michael McCaul of the great state of Texas, thank you so much for your time on a very busy week. We appreciate it.
No, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me.
This is Jason Chaffetz with your Fox News commentary coming up.
TikTok CEO Shou Chu tells Congress the video sharing platform's nothing to worry about.
There are more than 150 million Americans who love our platform, and we know we have a responsibility to protect them.
He testified for the House Energy and Commerce Committee and denies the Chinese government uses TikTok to collect information on and manipulate Americans, including teenagers. He says TikTok's parent company ByteDance is not an agent of China or any other country. Washington State Republican Kathy McMorris Rogers isn't buying it.
Your platform should be banned. I expect today you'll say anything to avoid this outcome.
The Biden administration wants TikTok sold. The Chinese government says it's opposed to that.
There's so few things that there's really strong bipartisanship on in Washington right now, and China is one of them.
Shannon Breams, the host of Fox News Sunday.
TikTok is viewed as something obviously based in China. They say, well, we've got separate business operations that deal with the U.S. markets. Lawmakers across the board appear unconvinced, saying, listen, ultimately, this company is under the control of the CCP in one way or the other, and it doesn't have America's best interests at heart. So, yes, you are going to TikTok off. the younger people.
Nice.
If you do this. But I think that it's looking more and more increasingly like that's going to happen.
If you were going to launch a campaign to make the children of your enemies stupider, there would be worse ways to do it. I understand that the Chinese version of TikTok, for example, has a 40 time limit for kids built in when you sign up. And the algorithm puts out actually more educational videos and science experiments and stuff like that, as opposed to, and look, I got nothing against funny dancing videos too, but the way it works is you get these dopamine hits and they just keep coming and coming and coming, and it's addictive.
Yeah, they do. I think we all know that with any kind of social media that you use, you have to be really disciplined. And I think it's much harder for young brains and young kids who this is the world they operate in. It's a virtual world. How many likes can I get? Did you see the latest dance craze? I'm going to do it now. I'm going to do a video and put it on TikTok. I mean, I sat behind a teenager on a plane a week or so ago, and just watching them through the seats, just fling through TikTok after TikTok after TikTok. I mean, I don't know how you wouldn't be just destroying your ability to have an attention span the way that they were going through this. And I think China knows that, like you said, the algorithms for their kids in their country are, look at this engineering student winning a trophy for this very intricate project that they put together. And yes, us, it's like, half-dressed twerking.
Right. One of our producers here for this show is young-ish, not a teenager anymore, but she wants it banned because she can't trust herself. She can't get herself off.
Right.
She wants them to take it away from her.
Right. Please help me.
Yeah.
It's the same thing we heard Senator Josh Hawley, not long ago talking about banning and, reining in time limits and different kinds of things and getting rid of some social media altogether. And he said, parents actually want us to do this because then they can point to us and say, sorry, federal government has banned XYZ, or federal government says you can only be on for a certain amount of time. He's like, they want us to be able to say, it's the feds who are the bad guys, but they want the tools. So yeah, I think we all realize we need a little help reining in our time on various websites and apps.
And some other social media time killer will come along to replace it with the kids, I'm sure, but it won't be tied to the Chinese government.
Well, it may not. Or I think about the kids are so stinking smart, they'll find a way around the bans.
Okay.
You can hide IP addresses and do all kinds of things. So I don't underestimate the kids' abilities to get to what they want to do.
Speaking of China's president, she spent a few days in Russia this week meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin. That alliance seems to be strengthening, could be a problem for the rest of the world, not China or Russia, including the United States.
Yeah, and they want to be that partner for countries out there that are looking for loans, that are looking for development, that don't have their own resources. We've seen that with China and a lot of places in Africa and across the world to say like, oh, let us come in and help with XYZ. If other people won't lend or other people won't help you with infrastructure, we will. And they're very smart about it, obviously. And anytime that we are not viewing them as a direct threat, maybe not, militarily to the U.S. homeland, but in, the sense of building these relationships and allies and alliances and technology and embedding themselves in other people's culture and finances and everything else. I mean, we're missing the opportunity. Now again, this is a bipartisan concern on the Hill, and there have been people on both sides of the aisle for years who have been saying, we're not taking these threats from China seriously enough. I think about Senator Mark Warner, Democrat who chairs the Senate Intel Committee. There have been people raising the red flag, and there are others who say, it's fine. We're overhyping it. It's not that big of a deal. This is just the normal course of business in the world.
Shannon, are you following the Federal Reserve tightrope? They're trying to get inflation down without hurting growth. They're now causing bank failures. It's a very tough plane to land.
It is. And I wish I'd paid closer attention in my econ classes in college. Some really great professors. And I'm like trying to dig and scrape and remember how all of these things are interconnected and kind of the dominoes that are out there. So we get a 1/4 point rate hike from the Fed as everybody's looking at them. Will they slow down? Will they stop the rate hikes? Are there going to be reversals at some point? And they do have not only the monster of inflation to deal with, but as you mentioned, these bank issues, the concerns about contagion. We are globally interconnected all over the world with banking systems, finances, inflation. All of those things have ripple effects everywhere. So interesting to see the Treasury Secretary seem like she was sort of, throwing the Fed chair under the bus a little bit about how he's managed this. But what it means for now is that the cost of borrowing money and getting loans on cars and houses and anything else is going to be more expensive.
So, Shannon, President Trump had said that he thought he was going to be arrested this past Tuesday. That now is not coming to fruition. It's not going to happen until at least next week. The grand jury has had a couple sessions delayed now. And sometimes this happens. It's a lot of people to wrangle. Somebody has a funeral, somebody gets COVID or whatever. We don't really know what's going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, and there's also some last-minute info that's come forward. You've got this attorney, Robert Costello, who's come forward to say that he was representing or working with Michael Cohen at some capacity at some point. Cohen's denying that. This guy never represented me. But Costello was watching from the outside and said, what I was hearing coming from the grand jury testimony and from what Michael Cohen had said, I felt like he wasn't telling the truth. And I thought it was my duty to come forward and share what I knew. He also says, the grand jury has seen maybe 6 relevant emails where he says more than 300. And he says, I've provided those. The members of the grand jury should see that. So he spent time with them this week testifying. Now we have this letter that has surfaced that appears to come from the time when Michael Cohen was still in good graces and working with the Trump organization, denying that the president had reimbursed his money. So obviously we're trying to verify all of these letters and the validity of those kinds of things. But it also is from a different time period before Michael Cohen himself came forward and gave very different testimony. So this attorney, Robert Costello, says, listen, if Alvin Bragg is pinning this whole thing on Michael Cohen's testimony, he's not the best witness. And there are issues of veracity. Was he telling the truth then, or is he telling the truth now? Who knows? We don't know what happens behind closed doors, but maybe that has been what has put the grand jury in a little bit of a tailspin or a delay. We don't know how the jurors were impacted by that testimony from Costello and whether they're going to get a look at this letter from 2018 from Michael Cohen.
We've talked a lot about a race not officially happening between the former president and Ron DeSantis, Florida's governor, who hasn't, again, officially declared, but we still sort of talk about him as if he's the main guy behind Trump in that race, for now at least. That's escalated a little in the past week, a little more insults from both sides.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, as you said, Governor DeSantis is not officially in, but there have been PACs and infrastructures and things put into place so that if he does make a decision, he hits the ground running. I mean, the money's in place, the donors are in place, the organization is in place. He can't officially cooperate with any of that stuff until he's made a decision if he's going to run. There's been a lot of talk that he wants to get through the legislative session there in Florida. They've got a law in the books that says something about not holding state office while you're running for federal office. And, there may be a fix to that legislatively. Who knows? Right. But I do think, everybody assumes that DeSantis is going to get in. And so the sparring back and forth is only going to heat up. He's walking a fine line by defending the president against the former president against things like the Alvin Bragg potential prosecution, indictment, that kind of thing, while also throwing in lines like, well, I personally can't speak to what it's like to pay off a porn star allegedly for an indiscretion. So it's clear that these two are going to get their digs in at each other. The former president, much more head on going after the governor. And if they end up on a debate stage or truly in a campaign against each other, it's inevitable. They're going to have to do this. But in the meantime, I think the governor is trying to keep some of his powder dry until if he is officially in the race.
Another guy we've talked about as a potential candidate now is looking even more potentially like a candidate, South Carolina Republican Senator Tim Scott.
Yes.
He has scheduled this summit, April 14th and 15th, with what he's calling a political update on that Saturday, the 15th. So maybe we'll hear from him then.
Yeah. And, he spent a lot of time in Iowa, New Hampshire, of course, South Carolina, his own home state, which is an important early state. And I've had a lot of conversations with him about kind of this take that he has on, can we take the high road? Can we have a conversation about faith and family and restoring our trust in our fellow Americans, which I think a lot of people think sounds good. And of course, they're for that. But is there a lane to run in a nasty primary with that message? Will it work? And I think he and his team have really been trying to see. He said to me, he genuinely wants to see what the reaction is in those early states about whether people would get behind something like that, or if it's just like, yes, I aspire to that. It feels good. But would it really work head to head against former President Trump? I don't know, but I think that he is in deep, serious consideration. He's also very effusive in his praise of former President Trump. Maybe they end up on a ticket together.
Shannon Bream, host of Fox News Sunday. Thanks.
Have a good one.
Hey,
Hi, it's Will Kane, co-host of Fox & Friends Weekend. Join me as I share my thoughts on a wide range of topics, from sports and pop culture to politics and business.
The Will Kane Podcast. Subscribe and listen now at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com.
It's time for your Fox News commentary. Jason Chaffetz. What's on your mind?
To oversight or not oversight? That's always the question. Usually the party that's in power in the White House does not like the other party conducting oversight into the affairs of how the executive branch is running their business. But back in 1814, interestingly enough, they started what is today's Oversight Committee. The idea was that for every government expenditure, Congress would be able to go in and look and see how this was done. This committee expanded, it contracted, it morphed into different names. And back in the mid-1800s, Abraham Lincoln actually joined this committee. He was known as Spotty because he didn't believe that the president was being truthful about where the Mexican-American War was fought. Did the Mexican-American War actually start where the president said it did? He wanted to know the exact spot of where it happened. Thus, you've had this kind of rigorous oversight time and time again. The United States is different. We're self-critical. We take a hard look. We should be going back and looking at the origins of COVID, what's going on at the border, what's been happening with the banking industry, and how we're spending these trillions of dollars of the American people's money. Oversight is invigorating, it's illuminating, and it's supposed to allow us, the American people, to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again. I'm sure it's uncomfortable for the people that are on the receiving end of this oversight, but it is what differentiates us in the United States of America. We are self-critical, and we need to continue to do it, even though it may cause and be uncomfortable for some. I'm Jason Chaffetz, the former chairman of the House Oversight Committee and the host of the Jason in the House podcast.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. And now, stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. Listen ad-free on Fox News Podcasts Plus on Apple Podcasts. And Prime members can listen to the show ad-free on Amazon Music. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
I'm Emily Campagno, and this is the Fox True Crime Podcast, bringing you closer to the story than you ever thought possible. Subscribe at foxnewspodcasts.com or wherever you download podcasts. These are the stories that keep you up at night.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust. And click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.